computer. Cool.
Thanks for joining us today, Helen.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
No worries. We've both been pretty excited to speak to you actually, and learn about what you're doing at the Brain Bank. Both Greg and I have had issues with concussion, and want to say anything about your stuff at the start?
Yeah, just again, as Shane said, excited. It's been a journey for both of us and for myself, just trying to find people who are educated and understand, and for you being at the sharp end of the science is really, really important for us to hear. And, our passion is passing this on to other people and giving them an actual pathway so they don't have to stumble as we had. So yeah, super grateful.
Can we just start, Helen, if you could just give us an intro about you're a professional hockey player, where you had a professional hockey player for the Ice Ferns, and now being a neurologist. Can you just start with that just as an intro, please?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess I come at this from two angles, right? I'm a hockey player. I play ice hockey, and I've played for many, many years, since I was like 10 years old. And I played for the New Zealand Ice Ferns since 2013. So I've been on the team for a long time, and still playing with them as well, at the highest level that our country goes to. So the World Champs, Division 2 World Champs for 9 tournaments now. So quite a long time with the team, and I captained the teams from 2016 through till 2020. So I spent a bit of time in leadership there as well. And yeah, obviously throughout playing, contact sport, I've encountered a few concussions myself, and probably what's affected me more is actually seeing my teammates that have had their own experiences with concussion and recovery, and also sort of coming at that from a women's sport perspective as well, where, things are, we're playing a contact sport that's pretty small in New Zealand. It's a minority sport, so that comes with all of its own challenges in terms of like fundraising, and then, being able to get to these tournaments, and then being able to keep yourself fit while maintaining a full-time job at the same time. And then from a professional side, I have a PhD in neuroscience. So I studied at the University of Auckland, and I did biomedical science here, and then did my PhD studying Alzheimer's disease. So I really trained predominantly in working with human brain tissue that's donated to the Human Brain Bank. And I'll talk a bit more about that soon. And what my specialty really was is understanding how the brain changes in Alzheimer's disease, which is a neurodegenerative condition which affects memory and other types of cognitive function. And so coming from that lens, I went over to the US and did some study over there as well. So after my PhD, I went and trained in the US as well, and worked at the National Institutes of Health over there, which is the largest biomedical research institute in the world. It's an incredible place to do science with some really just amazing researchers, and also like just a lot of resource, a lot of equipment and funding to be able to do, tackle some really hard questions. And throughout that time, I was really looking at what's happening at the earliest stages of disease. So when you have a degenerative condition like Alzheimer's, or other things like Parkinson's, what's happening really early in that disease? And the reason for that is because once we can diagnose someone with a condition, usually the brain has been affected quite severely for it to be showing symptoms. Our brains are just incredible at being able to adapt to all sorts of things that are happening. And at the point you start seeing symptoms is usually when things have gotten pretty bad. So my interest is really in how do we detect things early. And one of the risk factors for neurodegenerative diseases or dementia is head injuries. And I'm someone who has seen that in my hockey playing career, and I got really interested in trying to understand how head injuries and dementia are related, because we know that traumatic brain injury and mild traumatic brain injuries are associated with degeneration. It's a risk factor. And so I came back to New Zealand because that's the kind of work that I think I wanted to do in New Zealand for New Zealanders. So I came home, and we started a Sports Brain Bank initiative, part of our existing brain bank, in 2019. And so now I'm working with tissue that's been donated from families of former athletes who have passed away with and without neurodegenerative disease, and trying to understand that, trying to figure out how do head injuries contribute to long-term brain health outcomes. So that's kind of my backstory as to how I got here and why I'm here, and yeah, got kind of the personal side of it too.
Were you doing your job while you were playing hockey, or did the hockey come first?
Yeah, well, I mean, the hockey came first in the sense that I've been a hockey player for a lot longer than I've been a scientist,
Yeah.
but I was doing both kind of concurrently. So
At the highest level,
yeah, so
returning.
2013 which was when I first made the Ice Ferns team, was also the first year of my PhD. So I started, I was doing both all the time, which was a juggle in terms of, studying and being in the lab and then also trying to train and do all that kind of stuff as well. But
Fatigue would take its toll
very
on you.
supportive research team here to help me,
Yeah.
help me do that. And yeah, all throughout really. So even while I was in the US, I was still playing for the Ferns. I'd come back home for training camps and stuff like that. So I've been sort of doing it side by side now for 10 years.
Has your view on concussion changed within that time? Like you said, seeing self and the others around you and your work?
Yeah, I think it's changed more broadly, but I've definitely personally sort of seen it change as well. I mean, like everyone playing a contact sport, I think when you're young, you feel invincible, and it's almost a badge of honor to play through anything. And as I've done this research more and more, and I've gotten older and seen my teammates, have to stop playing because of concussions, some of them, I think it's made me think more about maybe it's more courageous to actually take a pause and show that that's okay, especially when you're leading a team. That probably the more important thing is, hockey will always be there for us, but our brain health is really important. So I think my perspective has changed very much from, play through everything to let's actually really think about how precious this organ is that, we can't replace. So yeah, I'd say it has.
Can you do you know the state that your brain is when you can determine you've got Alzheimer's or dementia yet? Like what percentage of the brain has been damaged by the time you can diagnose?
It does differ because everyone we sort of talk about this idea of cognitive reserve, which is essentially like the idea that your brain can kind of keep functioning even though there's a lot potentially going wrong at the microscopic level. Usually we see pretty heavy
We're lucky.
That's
yeah.
good.
Yeah. We see quite heavy involvement of certain areas of the brain involved in memory in Alzheimer's disease. And we know that by the time we start seeing symptoms, those parts of the brain are already affected with it's a protein called tau, which is the same protein that we see in CTE actually. And it's pretty much widespread throughout the hippocampus, which is the area involved in learning and memory by the time we can diagnose, with some level of certainty that someone has Alzheimer's. So yeah, we know it's already going on.
But by that stage, they'd have like speech problems, maybe memory, potentially body issues.
Yeah, well, with Alzheimer's, it's mainly people see the memory symptoms first. That's probably the most notable thing. But other conditions like Parkinson's disease, you see motor symptoms, difficulty moving, and there's all sorts of other things as well. Motor
Yeah.
neuron disease, Huntington's disease, frontotemporal dementia. There's lots of other conditions that can come about too.
We better start looking after our brains.
Yeah, I mean, our brain has a limited capacity to regenerate itself, but nowhere near the level that it would need to recover from these sorts of conditions. So, we only have one and it doesn't heal itself like a muscle does. So we have to look after it.
Can I ask you this first question, Helen? So I did research about the American Brain Bank and they have 1,000 brains, is that right?
Yeah, I think, they might even have more by now, but
More,
yeah,
yeah.
they have probably in the realm of 1,000. Yeah.
So they diagnosed 2/3 of those with CTE, and they would have had both contact and non-contact donations, I suppose. But so where are you guys with your donations? What state are you at? How many have you had donated, and how are you being able to spread the word of getting this research study done?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about brain banking, eh? Like, I think the first thing to note about brain banks is that the people who tend to donate to brain banks are usually people who worry that they have a condition or their family wants to understand more about what's happening in that person's life. So we do tend to see what we call selection bias. We are more likely to see the brains of people who have a condition. So in the case of the US, their brain bank is focused around sports and contact sports. So they have a very large number of donations from that and from people who worry. So it's hard to extrapolate the numbers from the brain bank to the general population because of that bias that we see. So since launching our sports brain bank in 2019, we obviously not much happened in the 2 years after that because of that pesky pandemic, but we've had contact from probably around 50 people that want to donate. And then there's forms that have to be completed and signed. And from those, we've got sort of in the range of sort of, I think maybe 10 to 15 forms that have come back, and we've had 8 to 10 donations, I think it is. But not all of those have had CTE. Some of them have had other things as well, Parkinson's, Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia.
Cool. So I suppose, because before you just spoke about how many different brain diseases there are, and for us as a country to understand them, it's going to be pretty helpful for everyone to sort of selflessly donate or understand the importance of this. Are you the only brain bank in New Zealand that are doing this research?
Yes, we are the only brain bank in general in New Zealand. So I guess there's a few things there as well that are important to think about. The first is that there are lots of different neurodegenerative conditions, and the symptoms can overlap quite a lot. So that's why it can be really hard to get a diagnosis, because especially when we're thinking about CTE and repetitive head injuries, you also have to exclude that the person could have Alzheimer's, or that they could have frontotemporal dementia or something else, because so many of those symptoms can look quite similar when you see someone in the clinic. And we need to see more of the brain tissue and the clinical notes side by side to go, okay, this is what was really distinctive about this condition. This is what's distinctive about that condition. And then the other argument is, okay, well, why does it matter whether you have frontotemporal dementia or CTE? For a person's day-to-day life, at the moment, we don't have treatments that can stop these conditions. We have some symptomatic treatments that can help alleviate some of the symptoms, but they don't stop the condition. But because in the brain, at the microscopic level, these are different diseases. And so if we're trying to make treatments actually stop the condition, we need to know what someone has, because what will work for someone with one condition is not going to work for someone with another condition.
Yeah.
And so it matters a lot. It matters for the people themselves who are experiencing this to know maybe what to expect, what might come next. You know, a lot of the times no one can tell you, well, what's going to happen? Am I going to lose my memory? You don't know. And then for us as researchers, we need to be able to recruit the right people to clinical trials so that we know that something does actually work if it's supposed to. And we need to be able to design treatments that are specific to each condition. So it is really important, and brain donation is massive in this whole quest to solve these diseases, because if you want to understand a disease, the best way to do it is to actually look at the brain of someone who had that disease. We can make a lot of guesses during life, but if we don't actually know, yeah, it's hard.
Can you look at, saying somebody could have dementia or could have CTE? Could we almost now see an age bracket? Like, maybe we're seeing these other brain conditions in older people, CTE and the things, take Billy, for example, we're seeing those at some of those CTE stuff at a lot younger age.
Yeah.
And do you think that's one way to look at it?
Definitely one way to think about it. I think, with CTE, we think about how much cumulative head injury exposure has someone had. And with elite contact sports, people are playing a lot very young. So that cumulative amount of impact really builds up over time quite quickly. And we think that that's why you start to see things happening in younger people more so than you do with Alzheimer's. Yeah. I think CTE is somewhat unique in the sense that we think we know what is causing it.
Yes.
With these other conditions, it's a little bit harder. We don't know exactly what causes Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia, but the age aspect does kind of play into it. We most commonly see Alzheimer's disease in people over 65, but it can occur earlier. Frontotemporal dementia actually can occur in people quite young as well. So there's still overlap. I think they're all considerations, but it sort of gets down to this idea of really trying to look at people as individuals and across a lot of different factors and say, okay, well, there's the head injury exposure. There's also that they're showing these symptoms, that they've got, this age of onset. They might have certain blood test or MRI scan features, and trying to see what the pattern of all of that information is and see how people actually group together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
That's where we need to get to. And I think at the moment,
we're not there.
No, I think it's not quite there yet. I think we're seeing everything in piecemeal, bits and pieces, some symptoms and this and that, and we're slowly getting towards understanding the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
In reference to CTE, how far behind is New Zealand compared to the States with research?
It's sort of a difficult one to answer. I think in some ways, we are just starting. From our perspective, 2019 is pretty recent to have started this work, and really, we only just got the funding to really get into it in 2021. So that was when my team actually started, doing the research. But in saying that, we're very well integrated with everything that's happening overseas. So we're in touch with all of our colleagues in Australia and the US, all over the world that are working on this. And so while we might be relatively new to enter the research field, I think I wouldn't say we're behind. We're right on the edge of cutting edge sort of stuff alongside of our collaborators. So yeah, I think it's important that New Zealand that we're doing this here, that we're not relying on international people to
it'll be
do it for us.
specific for our country. And then I suppose because we've had so many contact sport athletes, both community and professional, I suppose that's why I'm going to donate my brain to use guys. You can.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's me and Greg.
Oh, thank you. It's the most incredible gift to science, honestly, isn't it? Yeah.
Or again, it's so important for us to, like, both of us have our mates that are suffering, and like for my own case, there's no help, and Shane.
That's what it's about.
There's no help at the moment for us, and it's pretty hard, and we see our peers, suffering incredibly. Again, not getting help. It's for me, it's an easy decision to, if we can understand it more, then we can create a course of action to help.
And I suppose the research might help with what you just mentioned on, which is the length of time you expose yourself to concussion. And I've seen articles you've spoken about with age grade rugby contact sports. Do you want to touch on that anything at all?
Yeah, exactly. I think, first of all, I mean, the dream is, I'm an athlete myself. I don't want to stop sport. I love my sport, but I want to be able to know what's going on, be able to make a decision about what I do with my sporting career. And I think right now it's very difficult to do that because we just don't have the understanding of what's happening in the brain. I mean, around the youth sport and that kind of thing, that really comes back to what we know about CTE right now, which is that it's related to cumulative head injury exposure, not necessarily the number of concussions, the amount of exposure you have to impact to the head. And that can also be, we know that blast injury is a factor there as well. It's not just a collision, although collision is probably the most common. So we're thinking about how many times is a person colliding with someone at speed, where the head is moving violently, forward, backwards, side to side, twisting, that kind of thing. And that's happening every game, every training that we're doing. And probably that the higher the level you're playing, the more frequently you're training, right? So when we think about how do we reduce the exposure to all those impacts, one of the easiest things that we can do is, and this has really come from international efforts, is delay the time that we're putting kids into contact sport. So the example that we kind of think about is if you have a kid playing contact sport at age 8 versus a kid who's playing contact sport at, say, 13 or 14, the kid who started at 14 is having like 5 to 6 years less exposure than the kid who started at 8. So the idea there is really just how do we reduce the amount of impact. So that we could also talk about season length, actually having an off season. There's a lot of sports, we're kind of just keeping on going all the way through. We're not really having a break. So, reducing the season length, that kind of thing, having less contact trainings. I think it's going to look different for every sport. What would make sense for one sport might not make sense for another. But I think we just want to come up with ways that we can reduce that cumulative impact over our lifetimes.
And I suppose a really good example that you could show that this current system isn't quite effective is Billy's situation, because stage 2 is reasonably far along in the disease, and I think he started playing at 5. Did anyone from your team or clinicians that you know of have a discussion about how that process for Billy was created?
It's hard to know with every individual, and it's hard to know, you just don't know what kind of things they were exposed to when they were growing up. And obviously the head injury exposure is probably the biggest thing we look at in the context of CTE is how far along. And the US studies, they've looked at a lot more brains than we have, obviously, and their conclusions from that work is that the stage of CTE severity, so how advanced those changes were in the brain, is associated with longer playing careers. So the longer you play, the more likely it is that you'll have a longer, more severe changes in your brain. So that's definitely work that I guess we would look to here to say, yeah, it's probably the long duration. And that's probably also why we see these changes happening in younger people, because they've started very young, and that could be a lot of acute injury exposure if that's directly correlated. Yeah.
Are some people more susceptible than others?
Oh, that's the big question.
Yeah.
That's the massive question. And I look at this all the time and think, why is it that two people can grow up playing whatever sport it is side by side their entire lives, make it to the top of their sport, whatever, and one person is absolutely fine and the other person's not? And I don't have an answer, honestly. I don't, because like everything, we are individuals. We have our own genetic risk factors, we have our own lifestyle risk factors, we add head injury into that mix, and how all of these things connect and correlate and come together to turn into a degenerative brain disease. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out. And it's also coming back to brain donation, why it's really important to study the brains of people who have had this head injury exposure, but they're fine. Like, we need to understand, why are some people with all this head injury exposure okay, and why are some not? And what is the difference? If they've both had the same exposure, what's different in the person who had CT versus the person who didn't? So I think some people would say to me, oh, you don't want my brain because, you know, I'm pretty normal. Like, no, that's why we need it. So yeah, it's really important to get the balance.
Is there, I've seen research saying that some people are living with CTE but don't have the, don't obviously get the breakdown. Is that a thing?
In terms of that not experiencing, when you say they're living with
symptoms
CTE
or side effects, or
yeah, I mean, I think diagnosis is really hard at the moment. It's really challenging because we don't have an objective test or a measure that says, yes, you definitely have CTE. And so we do the best we can to diagnose by eliminating everything else that it could be. And if that's all that's left, then we go, okay, it's probably CTE. So you'll see people will have a diagnosis of possible or probable CTE. And I think it's important to remember that even though we don't have a treatment to stop the condition, we do have lots of things that we can do to help people manage what they're experiencing, whether that's the mood swings, whether that's the memory changes or cognitive changes, attention, concentration, that kind of thing. There's lots of different things out there that can be, you can get help to manage that, so you can still have good quality of life. People can live with this condition, but obviously we don't want people to have to.
Can you give us what would those be? Because we've talked to a lot of people, and as I have, and there's people say you can't do anything. There's people saying, I've seen there's a lot of amazing stuff out of America. Dr. Mark Gordon's work, who, they're showing that they're helping people improve. What are some of the things that we could be doing to
yeah,
be better?
a whole range of things. I think there's different ways to come at it. The first is by knowing what it is, you're in a really good position already, because if you don't know what's going on, you start to think you're going crazy and you're not looking after yourself, and who knows what happens, right? You get isolated, and it's a horrible situation. When you do know what's going on, then you go, okay, this is something I can do something about. So just knowing is useful. And then also there's lots of things we can talk about in terms of what we know is good for your brain health. So exercise is good for your brain health. Obviously you don't want to be doing the whole contact, hitting your head if you've got a condition like this. But exercise and movement is really, really good. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. So eating well, not drinking too much, doing all that kind of stuff that's, we know is going to look after your brain. That's going to slow the progression of anything that's going bad, right? There's lots of work showing that various sorts of dietary interventions can sometimes help with these sorts of things. I'm not as up with that literature as to, what's the thing to take, but, there are lots of various ways of eating and thinking about your metabolism that will help you eat well and that kind of thing. There's also sleep, different types. And Shane, I think we've talked a little bit about this before. Sometimes, sleep and how you're sleeping and prioritizing that can be a massive thing. Then, there's lots of experimental things out there as well. But I think sticking to some of those tried and true, and the community and the avoiding that isolation and being integrated in the community is also really good for making sure your quality of life is high.
Anything on supplements? I've seen a lot of work and use it. Both of us use it. Creatine, high dose fish oil. Yeah, some of those things that there's a lot of research out there now showing that they're really protective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I don't know exactly all the single things that are super promising, but I know that there is a lot of work going on looking at how do you shift your diet to optimize for energy to the brain. So there's lots of talk, especially in the Alzheimer's field, around how, you know, the brain needs a lot of energy, and sometimes the processes that happen inside your cells to get that energy out of food and stuff is not as efficient as it could be. So there are certain things that people are trying, like I've heard of some people trying keto and having pretty good effects with that with Parkinson's disease. So I don't know enough about it to be like, yes, this is the thing, but I think
carnivore diet's pretty good. It's helped me a lot in the last month.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Coffee's been good too. I haven't been drinking coffee for a month, Helen.
Yeah, there you go. See, like things like that can maybe, you know, just take away that stimulant or something like that. And I think it's going to be quite individual. Every person might find something that works that doesn't. But I think having the knowledge that you have a progressive condition versus a condition that's not progressive, I think that's a pretty big step. Yeah.
Right. Can I just go back to what you said about the rule change, the international suggestions for age grade contact to start? The professional game's definitely noticing that because they're changing the exposure to training, and over in the UK they're changing game, how many games you play in a season. So they are recognizing that science. But an interesting thing that you might have a good opinion on is the culture in our country. So you came back to New Zealand to give back to our country, and this research which is cool. But I wonder how do you think that we can change our culture in terms of raising that age grade in contact?
Yeah. I think there's I mean, I don't think it's just a New Zealand thing, but I think in general we think that training more is training better. And I think that's maybe something that we could start rethinking. We don't necessarily have to do
for the age grade, Helen.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, we're thinking about young kids, and I think about this in my sport context, right? So when we talk in ice hockey, we don't start playing full check until I think the kids are about 14, 15. And that's really coming from the mindset that there are so many skills you need to get really, really good at before contact is really important. And so, you know, kids playing ice hockey learn how to skate, they learn how to puck handle, they learn all that kind of stuff. And so you can train a lot in a different area and really elevate your game.
Ooh,
and bring in the contact later. And I don't know how that applies to every other sport, but that's kind of how we think about it in hockey. And also, I think when you're going through, like when you're growing, I remember this when I was growing, you know, you're a little bit less coordinated and certain, you know, when you're a kid, and it can be a little bit hard to get it right all the time. So thinking about how do we teach kids to not only initiate contact, but how to receive it and how to fall and how to do that well. I think those sorts of mentality, I think just thinking a bit more about contact isn't just the collision, it's the technique of the collision, it's how you receive the contact. And maybe as a country, if we just focused a bit more on that instead of how like tough we are, we probably do quite, I'm sure we'll make a difference at some point.
That's the specific thing though, because we want our kids to provide an entertainment of collision. It's the buzz. But like you said, if we put more time into thinking about what can progress their careers later on by developing skills.
We love the hits, right? I mean, do you remember like the Smashed 'Em Bro? Like I remember watching that and we were like, we loved it, right?
Of the show,
Now we're talking to one of those guys and they're all hurt.
But maybe we need to be thinking about how do we highlight just some really impressive, like skillful technical plays rather than the collisions. Just take some of the emphasis off. I mean, contact's always going to be part of these sports. It's a massive part of the game, but maybe we don't need to make it everything.
Quick question. What are your thoughts on, in America, the American NHL, the NFL, they won a case for CTE and hockey lost. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know the ins and outs of all the cases.
Yeah.
And I don't know all the ins and outs of the legal systems as well, but I think it's some of the really difficult things and all of I think it all comes back to diagnosis. It's really difficult to show that the symptoms that someone is experiencing 10, 20 years after their playing career is related to that playing career. I think that's what's really difficult. And when you're trying to make that case in court, I'm sure that that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Is to actually show that this caused this. And we can't do the experiment to show that, right? Like you can't get two groups of people and hit one half of them on the head all the time and one not. It's not ethical. So you have to look at the weight of evidence for it, and then we also need to I think we just need to collect better data on people.
Yeah.
And you know, having more frequent checks of people's cognitive function, having more frequent checks of certain, we need to develop the tests really that would tell us that, you know, brain function is good or not. And having that data over time, that's going to start to build the picture that actually, you know, these changes started happening 10 years before, and therefore that's what is mostly contributing. So yeah, the whole area of lawsuits is very, very difficult. As a scientist, you know, in the field that I'm in, I don't know, yeah, how much I can really say on them without being informed. But I guess on the one hand, I want to acknowledge that the research is in its early days, and we do need more of it. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that people are experiencing, like we need to honor the symptoms and what people are going through. So I think both of those things can be true, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
When do you think we'll have enough information to make some of these changes? Example, like Veterans Affairs for me are saying that there's no proof of cognitive change because I have no baseline from when I was 17 and joined the army, and then starting my special forces career where I was exposed to, you know, to most of the damage. Yeah, because I don't have that, it's very hard to take my word and say, well, my partner's word or my family's word. Yeah, when are we going to bring in baseline testing for young people at whatever age we're starting them? So we've got that definitive start point to, you know, to go back to in a reference like you've got these symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, what you've suggested is actually a really good idea, right? Is to have baseline information about how people are going, you know, like an annual medical check with some kind of neurological assessment in there as well. Like that's probably a good way of thinking about it. I have some colleagues at AUT that are trying to get this idea going of like a brain war and a fitness, right? Like how are you going? Like just not necessarily that anything's going to change or we're going to stop if you know, we're not going to force anyone to do something if they're showing one thing on one test. But I think having that information is important. It's useful for what we're trying to talk about here. So in terms of how much evidence do you need to make a decision, I think we've got plenty. It's not rocket science to say that getting hit in the head is not good for you, right? Like,
but when does that become ethical to the point of protecting our young,
you
know, protecting our people? I always talk about for rugby, we've seen, you know, changes in tackle heights and these other rules coming in the military. They've changed a whole lot of rules around things we could do and distances and firing rates. Those changes come about because of something. But all of us pre that, you know, the ones who have, so we've got enough information to change the rules, but we haven't got enough information to protect those past or to put things into place now to protect our young.
All right. From my perspective, I think there's enough evidence that head injuries, you know, that is a risk factor for a long-term neurodegenerative condition. Not everyone is going to get that, but that's enough of a risk factor. I think that it's worth putting things in. I don't see, I mean, it's probably resource, right? That's the reason that things don't get put in. That would be my guess. But
And culture as well, because without research, you can't influence culture, but then without resources, we're not getting any research done. There is some research and resources for CTE diagnosis over in the States, because we know Carl got diagnosed from someone in the States for CTE. Do you know about the criteria that we could bring from the States into New Zealand, and if that's possible, or would the Brain Bank or AUT be able to provide that?
We don't have the clinical resources to provide it. It needs to be something that we would implement through the public health care system. At the moment, I think it's really, really hard because there's such a big wait time to see neurologists in the public system. You know, the main way that people would receive a diagnosis is to go to their GP. So talk to your GP. And I guess the tricky thing here is that you need to have evidence of a progressive decline. And so usually that's what's hard, right? Is like you have symptoms and then you need to see if they're actually getting worse over time. And so that's instantly a delay of, you know, a year or maybe more. And then you need to get referred to see a neurologist or a neuropsychologist who is a clinical person that can look at cognitive function and say, yes, this is not normal, or actually, no, you're within the normal realms. And then for CTE specifically, we need to eliminate anything else that it could be. So yeah, they'd look at the pattern of symptoms, what started first, maybe they'd look at some tests or brain scans to see what kind of is going on. And if nothing else can be eliminated and you have an extended history of head injury, then that's what the US criteria would be with CTE. But I don't think that there's any formal diagnostic pathway here, or I might be wrong, but from what I'm talking to people, that seems to be how things go, is seeing a GP and then seeing a neurologist.
I don't think there's a formal process. I think it's still just down to the neurologist or neuropsychologist that you get assessed by.
Yeah.
Could I offer even in that, and again, back to my own journey's been really difficult. Neuropsych assessment, 2.5 hours of testing. My results come back noisy, was her definition. And then what I did do all right, and I was rated at low normal. But for me, having been a former special force operator, I was at the top 1% of the NZDF, you know, making split decisions whether people live or die. Well, I'm nowhere near that anymore, but the test results don't, because you couldn't take into context, you know, or the process doesn't take into context of who I had been and the level I was operating at. So the test here, one, noisy, but then, yeah, you're doing okay. So no, because that's the change for me, where I used to be and where I am now. So it's really hard even in that process, I think, to say, again, back to being individual.
Absolutely.
And if a person doesn't understand the context of where that person's come from, it's hard to even look at a test result. And
I mean, that's huge, actually. That's a really good point. From where you were operating at the top level of the top, that's a pretty big difference.
I can't even in your context, I can't even hit the puck anymore. I can't even see it. You know, where I used to play for New Zealand, that's the example. You know, that's what
makes the case for the baseline.
Oh no, you're doing all right. So yeah, I'm not actually, but my test results don't show that.
I think that's a massive problem, isn't it? You need the baseline.
Without that.
Are you able to connect with other public organizations or private organizations to try and progress the criteria for someone like what Greg's talking about, or a CTE criteria?
That's the plan. That's what we want to do. So at the moment, I'm a team of 3 and 3 very lab-based scientists, but a big goal of our future research, and again, unfortunately, it's all funding dependent, isn't it? Is to really look at, okay, what is the pathway right now? How many people are out there? We don't even have these questions, right? Is how many people in New Zealand have a history of head injuries and are experiencing the sorts of things that you are, Gregg? So we don't have that number, and I am struggling to find out where we'd find that data. So it's going to be a big job to actually find that. And then the other thing we want to do is launch a bit more of a longitudinal study, so a clinic sort of idea where we would see people semi-regularly, maybe every 2 years or so, and with blood tests and MRI scans and that kind of thing, to try and understand what is normal and what is progressing, and what does it look like if you have this pattern of symptoms. Do you have certain changes in your blood test or in your MRI that would help us determine that something is progressing? So those are the sorts of studies we want to do, but they are hugely expensive. So it's just going to take a bit of time as unfortunately, as everything in science, it just takes way too long. But we want to make this pathway better, and to make it better, we need tests that can specifically say this is not normal, this is normal. That's the goal.
Just leading on from when you talk about blood tests, again, in my own research from around the world, understanding the effects that I've had in the downregulation of a whole lot of my systems, wasn't until I went to a functional medicine doctor, and she's been amazing at really digging into my blood work and identifying exactly what's also affected.
Mm.
You know, that's another thing that I don't see happening for people is
Mhm.
this real holistic approach to also let's dig in and see
in the
me,
limbic system.
yeah, my testosterone's super low, cortisol was
Mm.
super high, all of these other effects that we see from brain injury. And if we're
Yeah.
not doing that in conjunction, so when I talk
Mhm.
about supplements, I'm on a strict regime that's specific to me, and the effects of all of that, as a
Mhm.
process. And if we're
Yeah,
not,
the blood work is, it's probably the preferred route of finding a marker, right? Because it's not too invasive. There are some studies in the US that are looking at spinal fluid, but it requires a lumbar puncture, which is not, it's an invasive
not
thing. It's
fun,
not a fun thing to do.
yeah,
And, there's some really exciting research coming out in the field of blood biomarkers, which are basically molecules in your blood that tell you that something's happening in the brain. And so, in Alzheimer's field, we're seeing new tests for types of tau, phosphorylated tau, that are proving to be really quite specific at detecting when someone is, Alzheimer's versus something else. And so we really want to apply that to CTE and head injuries and see, is there some specific marker that is, we see it, if we see it, we know that it's not supposed to be there. So that's the kind of work we want to do, and it's working with some really quite high tech, to be honest, really ultra sensitive assays that just aren't available in your regular lab testing environment. So this is really, on the edge of research kind of testing, but you got to start there before you could get it more mainstream. Yeah.
What are your thoughts? We've talked to a professor in Australia, and because we've seen with players here, and they've tried to label it alcoholism or all of these different, they've tried to throw it away. But he talked about the people in America have identified the pathology, the towels from, CTE are very different to any of the pathologies of alcohol or drugs or, that. So how do we put a line in the sand
Yeah,
and
this
say
comes up a lot, doesn't it?
it's no longer an excuse to say that these lifestyle factors have caused it? It's not helping them, obviously, but
yeah, it's always going to be a complicated interaction. And again, it's looking at the individual, right? So there is a form of dementia that's related to alcohol, and he probably talked about this. But the pathology, what you see in the brain, the changes you see in the brain are very different to CTE. It's not the same pathology at all. So if you have someone without head injuries and excessive alcohol consumption, the pathology is not CTE. I haven't done this work myself. This is studies that have been done overseas. So I don't think it, we at the moment we haven't seen CTE without the head injury exposure. So that's where I think the strength comes in, is you don't see the alcohol pathology without the head injury in CTE. So I guess what I'm coming to is these things are going to interact. We know that excessive alcohol consumption is also not good for the brain. It's also going to exacerbate anything that is potentially going on. So I don't think we can ever disentangle it, because a person is complex and multifaceted. But if you have neurological changes that are happening, or changes in your cells that are happening as a result of the head injury, I think it's logical to think that the alcohol use is going to exacerbate that and make it worse. Saying that the alcohol caused it, I don't think, I think it's too, I don't think you can disentangle those two things. But what we know is that alcohol by itself does not cause the same pathology as CTE.
Yeah.
So I think when you think of the symptom profile that we're talking about, it's really hard to say what came first. Like, does the changes that are happening in your brain predispose you to being more likely to consume more alcohol and therefore make the cycle even worse? Or are you having alcohol and then adding head injuries? And, do you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to, yeah. But I would say that to anyone who was worried about anything neurological, alcohol does not help.
Yeah.
So we asked that same question on, there's also been a lot of finger pointing that people had mental health issues, first trying to say CT doesn't exist, but then accepting it does. But what are we seeing first? The brain injury CTE leading to mental health issues, or mental health issues already?
Yeah, well, I mean, we know that head injuries and mental health issues are going to go hand in hand, right? If you have a head injury, that's something that is going to affect your mood and your emotion, everything like that is all going to be entwined in that. So I think what's challenging is that we're talking about long term here. So we're talking about sort of 10 years or so post head injury exposure. So you've taken away the head injuries, and we're still left with the cognitive symptoms that are going on in there as well. And from what we can tell from post-mortem brain studies, looking back at what symptoms those people have, mood changes, depression, this kind of emotional dysregulation where you sort of snap. These sorts of symptoms. Yeah, those sorts of symptoms are associated with the brain pathology as well, but we don't know if they're exclusively caused by the brain pathology. So I guess this is a sort of a roundabout discussion really, but what I'm sort of getting at is it's very difficult to say how much of it is caused by the changes that are happening in the brain and how much of it is happening alongside it.
Yeah.
And I think if someone has been treated and really working through a lot of the mental health pathways, support pathways, and nothing's getting better, then it's worth looking at whether there's something else going on. And I think at the moment that shift to looking at what else could be happening here is not, even the connection to past head injuries doesn't often happen as well. So maybe just some awareness that maybe there's an underlying head injury history that could be contributing is going to be useful.
How quick, again, Billy's case, my own observations of Billy's stories, yeah, he went down that path of that mental health and the trying to get that, or them giving them the meds, and not one of it worked. My own observation is like, nobody took the time to step back and go, we need to take another holistic look at this. We need to understand that everything we're doing for him right now is not working, and that's changed. Medication's changed over time, but zero effect.
Yeah, what else could be going on,
right? Yeah, quickly enough, we didn't adapt and relook and reassess and give them a different pathway, at least try different avenues. We need that education as well, that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think it's just so hard, isn't it, when you're not feeling the way that you used to feel, and you're trying all these things but nothing's working, and you're instantly going to go, well, what's wrong with me, right?
Yes.
So and that's what I think we need to fix that.
People are very quick to throw out labels, schizophrenia and this and that, and they don't fit, and a lot of people will hold that label pretty tightly and get the meds accordingly, and it doesn't help.
I've been talking to a young man that had concussion problems between 10 and 16, and it's taken him a few years of getting help from psychologists and doctors to finally agree that he could be having these issues from concussions that he had from a young age. And it sort of started, he's 21, it started about 18 to 21. So I think with better research and good resources, that we can educate people to show doctors that if you look at someone's history and they've got a lot of concussion problems and mental health, at least look at the concussion problems earlier. So then don't leave it too long and we put themselves at risk of the worst situation. I did want to ask about your biometrics with the blood measurements that you're taking. Do you have any prediction about how long that will take to find a diagnosis through that process?
Yeah, I can't give you a number right now. What I can say is, I wish I could. I know that
where are you at with it?
We're trying to get funding.
Okay, let's talk about that. How can we get you some money, Helen? What sort of process are you looking for?
Well, look, with the blood studies, there's the Americans are also onto that with good funding. So they're launching their study. I think they've launched a couple of months ago to collect blood and start doing some of these assays. And so it's happening. It's happening, and we just want to make sure we can do the same thing here in New Zealand to kind of add into that, right? But I mean, what we think we're going to see, we know there are certain types of tau that we see in the postmortem brain tissue that might end up in the blood as well, based on what we know from Alzheimer's. So what we want to be able to do is actually compare people with head injuries to a group of people that have Alzheimer's, and that group is already established, to see how different they are. So that's what we're trying to do with that study. So yeah, that's what we're trying to get funding for.
Alzheimer's can show that in the blood. You can see that.
We can see various features of amyloid protein and tau protein, different types of tau protein that are looking very promising for distinguishing Alzheimer's from other conditions. So we've got some real experts here at the Centre for Brain Research that are doing that work. Dr. Erin Corsten, if you want to look her up, she's the one that's doing some really incredible work on that, and Professor Lynette Tippett. And they are doing this work right now with a group that have early stage Alzheimer's. And so we want to be able to compare to that. So that's kind of what we're fundraising for, really. And also to be able to check the brain tissue that we're getting to see what we're seeing in the blood, does that match? Because you need to know that what you're looking at is actually from the brain and not from some other part of the body. Yeah, so funding, look, it's a tricky situation in New Zealand. We have government contestable funding rounds, which are for health research. So the Health Research Council of New Zealand, so we apply to them. There's also lots of amazing charities and foundations. The Neurological Foundation of New Zealand are brilliant. They've supported the Brain Bank for 30 odd years, I think, to keep us running with that, and we apply to them frequently for various research projects. I think what's hard, though, is that when you're applying for research funding, this is kind of a welcome to the world of research, you need a very specific question, and you need a very specific study that you're going to do to address that question. And some of the work that we need to do is what we would call quite blue sky. So we really need to do some sort of piloting and testing to see what is going to be the thing that we're going to put forward for these big funding rounds, right? And we rely, honestly, quite a lot on philanthropic donations for that, because it's what our director here, Sir Richard Ford, we call it dream money. Yeah. Because it's the kind of money that, we're dreaming up what we think is going to be the answer. But the big funding rounds aren't going to fund it unless you can show that it's likely, right? So we pull together all this information, all these experts, and everyone's like, this is what we think the lead is, but we need the money to be able to test some of those leads before we can go, okay, right, that's the one. Off we go to the big studies and ask for the big amounts of money. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And right now we sort of, we leech a little bit from what our colleagues are doing overseas to see what they're finding and what we think the lead's going to be, but we need to show that we can do it in New Zealand. So yeah, if anyone wants to come and support our research, you can donate to the Centre for Brain Research and we can put it toward that.
Just a side note on that, reach out to Veterans Affairs. I don't know where that would go, but they have money for research and they haven't used it for a long time.
Right.
There's quite a big pool of money sitting there.
Okay.
Something that should be important to them. Now, in my case, I'm the first in New Zealand to present mine. So, it's potentially going to open the floodgates.
I know our colleagues in the US are very closely paired with the Veteran Affairs over there, and but because for starters, a lot of people are athletes. You don't get into the highest levels of the armed forces or the police or anything without being incredible athletes. But also because blast injury is a growing concern, and the overpressure that comes through from those blasts. So we don't know enough about it other than it does cause the same kind of injury to the brain as a collision can. So yeah,
we're seeing. I was privy to a research that's been done overseas. I can't say where, but that's showing just one 6-week sniper course is demonstrating changes in the brain.
Wow.
Yeah, so shooting large caliber weapons just 6 weeks is creating change the brain structure. So, we know it's really
we owe them something too. We owe them the best care because they have given us this freedom that we've got.
Absolutely. It's one of the most selfless careers that you can have is to serve others. So yeah, absolutely.
I think so.
I think I'd love to see New Zealand Rugby help you out financially because they've got a lot of money and resources put into helping look after or research long-term brain health of athletes is what rugby is about, the culture, because we see a lot of well-being ads and stuff, but maybe hopefully someone can see this and recognize your research as something credible.
What are your thoughts on the resistance to that? Something we're finding, it's a real... People don't want to make that link for the reasons, but when people like you and Shane and I are, we're trying to help people and make it better, not take it away. But it needs an understanding, like you've said at the start. What do you think that resistance is to go?
I think fairly so. I think New Zealand Rugby and various other sporting bodies are, they want to apply the biggest most rigorous assessment of the research that's out there, to make sure that they're making decisions that are right for their players. And I totally understand that. And as I said before, I think the research is relatively young, but I don't think that precludes us from making decisions that we know are going to be good for the brain, right? Like we don't need crazy amounts of research to go, let's avoid head injuries. But I do think, we have a good working relationship. We've been open discussions. We've had great discussions around what is this? What do we know? What do we not know? So, I don't know all the ins and outs of business and all that kind of stuff. I'm assuming there's all sorts of things on that side that they have to consider. But I also think, credit where credit's due, the awareness of head injuries and, the changes that are being made to try and address that and reduce concussions and look after, the direct acute concussion symptoms is a good thing. It's gone a long way from it has 10, 20 years ago. So I'll give, that's good. And now we just got to make that next step to go, okay, well, now what about 10 years? What about,
So, from now too, it's not just in the past, from the future, exactly, for the retiring players.
Yeah. And we'll always have the door open. I'm an athlete myself, so I'm, we're always there for discussion and stuff. I think, it's always complicated in the science world as well, where, when you think about where your funding is coming from, external people are always going to look at it and say, oh, okay, well, that person's funded you, so, is your research somehow affected by the fact that they funded you, right? So there's all those sorts of things. I think doing the most rigorous and comprehensive science in the best way possible so that everyone trusts what the outcome is, I think that's the best way forward.
Absolutely, Helen.
For everyone. Yeah.
Awesome. You want to wrap it up? Do you have anything to finish with?
Yeah, I'd just say, Ian, finish. Thank you for what you're doing. And like I said, we appreciate it. And we know it's so important. And so many people are going to benefit once we, get further down the track. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how do we get something put together to hand out to some of the, for us, we've got the RSA, the Returned Servicemen Association, Veterans Affairs, some of these different other organisations that is, in my aspect, supporting veterans, so we can get these donations started, and saying, how would we do that for all sports in New Zealand? How do we have a pamphlet at the GP? Got all these pamphlets on the wall about sugar and that, how about we have a CTE one so people can look and how
do you raise awareness? Yeah, absolutely. I think getting some resources out there is going to be really important, just so people know that the brain bank is a thing, it exists. We're here, that the research is happening. It's happening in New Zealand, and also what CTE is. There are some good resources online. I would direct people to the Concussion Legacy Foundation website. They've got a lot of really good resources about CTE, what it is, and we're going to look to work with them more to try and accelerate some of that outreach as well, because they've got a really, really great network going on. But also, hey, thank you guys as well, because this is a tricky topic and we need to talk about it, and you guys are making a platform for us to talk about it. So thanks for doing this. It's really cool.
You're welcome. And nice. Anybody else you think would be important to talk to, or otherwise education, help, if you can help us educate, because we can only come from our aspect, but you've got that scientific knowledge and expertise that we need to show people. It's not just our word, it's what you're doing and the way it works. That's the truth. Yeah, super important.
Yeah, get some good outcomes for everyone, as fast as we can.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, Helen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Have an amazing day.